The wind howled through the desolate streets of Virginia City as the government's black SUV pulled up in front of the Washoe Club. Its once glorious exterior, now decayed and crumbling, loomed over the investigators like a haunted relic of a forgotten era. The old wooden sign, creaking in the wind, seemed to whisper their doom. No one in the town ventured near the place anymore. Rumors of missing people, shadow figures, and violent deaths had driven them away. But for Agent Marcus Vane and his newly assembled paranormal investigation team, the Washoe Club was their latest mission. "I don't like the feel of this place," said Agent Nora Graves, the team's tech expert, as they stepped out of the SUV. Her breath came in quick clouds in the freezing night air. "It feels like the walls are watching us." Vane glanced at her, nodding. He couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere. The air itself seemed heavier here, filled with an energy that pressed down on their chests. "Let's set up. We'll start with the ground floor and work our way up." The team, armed with cutting-edge ghost hunting equipment, walked up the creaky steps of the Washoe Club. As soon as they stepped inside, the temperature dropped even more. The old building seemed to exhale around them, as if their presence had stirred something that had been sleeping for far too long. "Thermal imaging cameras set," Graves whispered, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her equipment. "But there's already movement. Third floor. Cold spots, but it's moving fast." Agent Samuel Hayes, the team's muscle and firearms expert, turned his flashlight towards the stairwell. "Could be a crawler," he muttered, referring to the bizarre, twisted entities known for scuttling up walls and ceilings. His grip tightened on the pistol holstered at his side. They started their slow ascent up the stairs, the wood groaning beneath their boots. The farther they climbed, the more they could feel the presence of something, watching them. Each breath was labored, like something was sucking the air out of the room. Shadows flickered just outside their flashlight beams, and whispers echoed from nowhere. "I don't like this, man," said Hayes, his voice unusually shaky. "It's like the whole building is alive." Just as they reached the second-floor landing, a door slammed shut, followed by a woman's piercing scream echoing from the floor above. "Third floor," Vane ordered, his heart racing as he drew his weapon. They rushed up the stairs, only to find an empty hallway bathed in cold. The scream had stopped, leaving only an eerie silence. And then they saw it, a figure at the far end of the hallway, a shadow darker than the night, its outline sharp and unnatural. It stood motionless, watching them. "Graves, get a reading on that," Vane hissed, his pulse thundering in his ears. But Graves was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. That's not a ghost." The figure shifted, moving in a way that no human could, its body twitching and distorting, like reality itself was bending around it. And then it charged impossibly fast. "Move!" Vane shouted as the shadow raced towards them. The team scattered just in time as the shadow man rushed past them, its body phasing through the walls like smoke. But the true horror came from the ceiling. There, clinging to the rafters, was a crawler, its elongated limbs stretched out, and its pale, eyeless face turned toward them, emitting a guttural clicking noise that echoed down the hall. Jesus Christ! Hayes fired his gun, the bullets punching through the thing, but it didn't slow down. The crawler dropped from the ceiling, landing with a sickening thud before it skittered on all fours, its joints bending backward in grotesque angles. "Fall back!" Vane shouted as the team retreated toward the stairs, but the moment they turned, another crawler appeared at the base of the stairwell, blocking their exit. "We're trapped," Graves yelled, frantically adjusting the ghost-hunting equipment strapped to her back. She pulled out an EMF meter, but the readings were off the charts, spiking wildly. "We're surrounded." The crawlers closed in, their twisted bodies jerking unnaturally as they advanced. Vane's mind raced, knowing bullets couldn't stop these things. He needed to think fast. "Electromagnetic pulse," Vane ordered. "Use the EMP." Graves fumbled for the device, her hands trembling. I don't know if it'll work on these things," she stammered, but there was no time to hesitate. She activated the EMP, and a pulse of energy rippled through the air. The crawlers screeched, their bodies convulsing violently as the pulse hit them. For a moment, it seemed to work. The creatures recoiled, their movements stuttering as though glitching out of reality. "Go now!" Vane shouted, pushing his team toward the door while the creatures were disoriented. They bolted down the stairs, their footsteps echoing loudly in the empty club. But as they reached the first floor, the temperature plummeted again. The walls seemed to close in, and that same oppressive energy wrapped around them like a noose. And then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the darkened hallway ahead. A figure emerged, not a crawler this time, but something far more terrifying. A man in a black suit, his face obscured by shadows, stood blocking their exit. His eyes glowed faintly, and a sinister smile crept across his lips. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice cold and ancient. Agent Vane's pulse quickened as the man in the black suit slowly stepped into the dim light. His face was obscured by shadows, though his eyes gleamed like twin embers, piercing the darkness. Vane's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary human. This was something far worse. "What the hell are you?" Vane demanded, gripping his weapon tighter. Hayes and Graves stood frozen beside him, their eyes wide with fear. The man smiled, a slow, sinister grin that sent chills down their spines. "You don't belong here," he said in a voice so calm it was unnerving. His words seemed to echo unnaturally in the cold air. Vane raised his gun, his fingers tightening around the trigger. "We're government agents," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This place is under investigation." The man's smile faded slightly. "Your government has no jurisdiction here. This land, these walls, they answer to something far older than your laws." Before Vane could respond, the lights in the hallway flickered violently, casting the room into deep shadow. The man's figure seemed to blur at the edges, as though reality itself was struggling to contain him. "Get out while you can," the man hissed, his voice distorting, becoming deeper and more guttural, "or you will never leave." And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the man vanished. One moment he was standing before them, and the next he melted into the darkness, leaving behind only the suffocating cold. "What the hell was that?" Graves whispered, her voice trembling. Vane didn't have an answer. His mind raced, trying to process what they had just witnessed, but it felt impossible. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this. He knew they were dealing with forces beyond their control now, things that didn't adhere to the rules of the living world. "We have to keep moving," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Stay sharp. Whatever's here, it knows we're not welcome." They cautiously made their way through the twisting hallways of the Washoe Club, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of wind setting their nerves on edge. The building felt alive, watching them with unseen eyes. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above. It sounded like something heavy had been thrown against the wall. Then came another sound, a faint, childlike giggle that sent icy fear racing down their spines. "We're not alone," Hayes muttered, his grip on his gun tightening. "I don't think we ever were," Graves replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As they entered the club's ballroom, a thick layer of dust coated the once grand floors. The room, though spacious, felt claustrophobic, as if the air itself was being sucked out. Their flashlights scanned the room, revealing faded wallpaper and tattered curtains swaying gently, though no wind was present. Suddenly, Graves' equipment started beeping wildly. "We've got EMF spikes, huge ones," she said, glancing at Vane. Before she could finish, the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. They elongated, pulling away from the walls like thick, living smoke. The temperature plummeted again, this time freezing their breaths in front of their faces. "Shadows," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible. The figures emerging from the darkness were unlike anything they had encountered before. Tall, humanoid shapes with distorted faces, their eyes hollow pits of nothingness. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were glitching through reality itself. "They're shadow men," Graves gasped, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her camera. "I've read about them, but I didn't think they actually." One of the shadow men lunged at Hayes, its elongated arms stretching toward him like tendrils of ink. He fired his weapon instinctively, the gunshots echoing deafeningly in the confined space, but the bullets passed right through the creature as if it were made of smoke. "Damn it!" Hayes cursed, backing up as the shadow man came closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "Fall back!" Vane yelled, motioning toward the exit. They scrambled toward the door, but as they did, more shadow men appeared, slipping through the cracks in the walls and the spaces between the floorboards. The creatures moved silently, but their presence was suffocating, like a pressure building in the room, threatening to crush them under its weight. "Graves, hit them with the UV light," Vane ordered, his voice strained with fear. Graves quickly pulled out a portable UV lamp from her bag and aimed it at the nearest shadow man. The moment the ultraviolet beam touched the creature, it shrieked, a horrible, high-pitched sound that made their ears ring. The shadow man recoiled, its form flickering violently before it dissolved into nothingness. "It works," Graves shouted, her voice filled with relief. But the relief was short-lived. The remaining shadow men began to close in, surrounding them from all sides. Vane knew they couldn't hold out much longer. "Run!" he yelled, leading the charge as they bolted for the exit. The shadow men hissed in fury, their forms twisting and distorting as they chased after them, their presence a dark cloud of death. As they burst through the doors and into the icy night air, the shadow men halted at the threshold of the club, unable to follow. Panting heavily, Vane turned to face the building. The windows were dark, but he knew the creatures were still watching. Outside the Washoe Club, the cold wind bit into their skin as they caught their breath. The shadow men had retreated into the depths of the building, but Vane knew it was far from over. He glanced at the others, Graves still clutching the UV light like a lifeline, and Hayes muttering curses under his breath as he reloaded his weapon. "That was close," Hayes said, shaking his head. "Those things. How do you fight something that's not even solid?" "We don't," Vane replied grimly. "We keep moving. We've still got multiple reports of entities, and we haven't even scratched the surface yet." Graves checked her equipment again, noting the increasing energy spikes. "There's something stronger out here," she said, her voice filled with dread. "The shadow men aren't the only ones we have to worry about." They moved away from the club, making their way down the desolate streets of Virginia City. The town had an eerie quietness to it, as though it was holding its breath. Every window they passed seemed to stare back at them, vacant and cold. Vane's radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence. "Team Alpha, this is Command. We've lost contact with Team Bravo at the cemetery. Be advised, we've got multiple reports of disturbances in that area. Proceed with caution." "Great," Hayes muttered, as if we weren't already walking into hell. They reached the edge of the town, where the cemetery loomed in the distance, rows of crumbling tombstones and twisted trees silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The air grew thick with tension as they approached. Vane signaled for silence as they entered the cemetery gates, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. Graves was scanning the area with her thermal camera when her face went pale. "Vane, look at this." She held up the screen, and what they saw sent a chill down their spines. Figures, dozens of them, were moving beneath the earth, writhing and crawling, just under the surface like some grotesque mass of bodies. "What the hell are those?" Hayes asked, backing up slightly. Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The earth trembled as something, no, many things, began to claw their way up from the graves. One by one, the crawlers emerged. Pale, emaciated figures with elongated limbs and black, hollow eyes. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones, giving them a grotesque, almost skeletal appearance. Their mouths were twisted into jagged smiles, revealing sharp, broken teeth. "They're crawlers," Graves whispered, her voice shaking. "I've only heard about them in legends, but they're real." The creatures moved with a sickening grace, their limbs contorting unnaturally as they pulled themselves free from the ground. They skittered toward the team, their movements jerky and insect-like. "Open fire," Vane ordered, raising his weapon. But just like the shadow men, the bullets did little to slow the creatures down. The crawlers were fast, faster than anything human. One of them lunged at Hayes, knocking him to the ground with a bone-rattling force. He struggled to push it off as its clawed hands slashed at him, tearing through his jacket. Graves activated her UV light again, sweeping it across the creatures. This time, the effect was different. The light caused the crawlers to screech in pain, their pale skin blistering and smoking, but it wasn't enough to stop them completely. "We need to fall back," Vane shouted, helping Hayes to his feet. They fought their way through the horde of crawlers, dodging their attacks as they made a break for the cemetery gates. The creatures gave chase, their inhuman screeches echoing in the night. As they reached the gates, Vane turned back, watching in horror as the crawlers swarmed over the tombstones, their eyes gleaming with hunger. There were too many of them. "We can't stay here," Graves said, her voice tight with fear. "We need reinforcements." Vane nodded, his heart pounding. "Let's get back to the command post. We need more than just guns for this." As they hurried back toward the town, the crawlers followed at a distance, their gaunt figures blending into the shadows. And somewhere behind them, deep within the Washoe Club, the shadow men waited, biding their time. The team barely made it back to the command post, their nerves frayed and bodies exhausted. The makeshift base, set up in an abandoned hotel at the edge of Virginia City, offered little comfort. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the low hum of machinery was the only sound cutting through the tense silence. Vane paced the room, his mind racing. They had encountered shadow men, crawlers, and God knows what else. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a haunted town. This was something much darker, much older. "Where the hell is Bravo Team?" Hayes asked, breaking the silence. "They were supposed to check in hours ago." Graves looked at her equipment, her fingers trembling. "No signal. It's like they've vanished." Vane glanced at the maps spread out on the table. The cemetery, the Washoe Club, and several other key locations had been marked, all tied to the reported disturbances. But something wasn't adding up. "We need to find them," Vane said. "If Bravo Team's in trouble, we can't just leave them out there." "Trouble?" Hayes scoffed, though his voice shook with unease. "They're probably dead by now." "Maybe," Vane admitted, "but we're not leaving until we know for sure." As they geared up to search for the missing team, a loud crash came from the hallway. They rushed out, weapons drawn, only to find the hall empty, except for the door at the far end, which was now wide open. Graves pointed her flashlight into the darkness beyond, her face paling. That door was locked. No one's been down there. A thick, unnatural mist had begun to seep from the open doorway, curling around the floor like smoke. The temperature dropped sharply, their breaths visible in the air. Without warning, the lights flickered, and then they were plunged into darkness. "What the hell?" Hayes started, but his voice was cut off by a deafening shriek that echoed through the building. It sounded inhuman, filled with rage and pain. And then, from the mist, figures began to emerge. Vane's heart stopped as he saw them, shadow men and crawlers, side by side, moving toward them with deadly intent. The hallway was swallowed in shadow as the creatures crept forward, their movements unervingly silent. Vane's heart raced, every fiber of his being screaming to run, but his feet felt cemented to the ground. Hayes stumbled backward, his weapon trembling in his hands, while Graves stood frozen, the light of her UV wand flickering as if it too sensed the oncoming terror. The mist thickened around them, curling into grotesque shapes that seemed to whisper in a language no human should understand. Just as the first crawler lunged toward them, Graves snapped back to life, sweeping the UV light across the hallway. The light burned into the creatures, causing them to writhe in agony, but still they kept coming. "Move!" Vane shouted, grabbing Graves by the arm. They sprinted toward the staircase at the end of the hall, the creatures pursuing them relentlessly, their hollow eyes fixed on their prey. As they reached the stairwell, the air turned icy. A low, guttural growl echoed from below. Something worse was waiting for them, something older and far more dangerous than the shadow men or crawlers. "Downstairs is suicide," Hayes said, panting as he gripped the railing. "We have to get to the roof." Without a word, Vane led them up the narrow staircase, the sound of the creatures growing louder behind them. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against them as they ascended higher and higher, the darkness growing thicker with every step. When they burst through the door to the rooftop, the cold night air hit them like a slap. The town of Virginia City sprawled below, its streets eerily quiet, as though the entire town was watching them from the shadows. "Lock it!" Graves shouted, slamming the door behind them. Hayes shoved a metal pipe through the handle, just as something heavy crashed into it from the other side. The door groaned under the pressure, the wood splintering as whatever was on the other side began to claw at it. Vane backed away, his eyes scanning the roof for any way out. "We're trapped," Hayes said, his voice cracking. "They're going to break through any second." Graves shook her head, her hands trembling as she held up her equipment. "No, there's something else here, something watching us." Vane turned, his blood running cold as he saw what she meant. On the far edge of the rooftop, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. A tall, skeletal man dressed in what looked like 19th century clothing. His eyes glowed faintly red, and his mouth twisted into a smile too wide to be human. That's the Phantom," Graves whispered. "The one they said haunts this place. But why is he here now?" The figure took a step forward, and the temperature dropped even further. The door behind them splintered as the creatures began to break through. But Vane couldn't tear his eyes away from the ghostly figure. "You're not supposed to be here," the Phantom said in a low, raspy voice. "None of you are." Then, with a suddenness that took Vane's breath away, the figure vanished. The wind howled around them, and the door finally gave way as the creatures poured onto the roof. Crawlers skittered across the ground, their limbs contorted and twisted, while shadow men loomed behind them, their hollow faces twisted in silent screams. "There's no way out," Hayes shouted, raising his gun as the first of the creatures reached them. But before they could react, the rooftop itself seemed to dissolve around them. The ground buckled, the air shimmered, and in an instant, they were somewhere else entirely. They stood in a long, narrow hallway, the walls lined with faded portraits of grim-faced people, their eyes following them as they moved. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the faint sound of whispers echoed in the distance. "Where the hell are we?" Hayes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vane shook his head, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. One moment they had been on the rooftop, and now they were in wherever this was. Graves checked her equipment, her hands shaking. "This isn't possible," she muttered. "We didn't just move. We were shifted." The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the dim light casting long shadows that flickered unnervingly. As they moved forward, the whispers grew louder, forming words that seemed to crawl under their skin. "Why are you here? Why do you disturb the dead?" Graves stumbled, catching herself on the wall. "It's like the house is alive," she said, her voice filled with dread. "Like it's trying to get inside our heads." Suddenly, the portraits on the walls shifted. The faces began to warp, their features twisting into grotesque masks of pain and terror. One by one, the eyes in the portraits turned black, oozing a thick tar-like substance that dripped onto the floor. "We need to keep moving," Vane said, his voice strained. "Whatever this place is, it's not real. It's trying to mess with our minds." But as they pressed forward, the hallway seemed to stretch farther and farther, as though they were walking in circles. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and soon, the walls themselves began to move, slowly closing in around them. "There's no way out," Hayes said, panic rising in his voice. "We're trapped." Just as the walls threatened to crush them, a door appeared ahead. A simple wooden door with a brass handle, standing in stark contrast to the decaying walls around them. Without thinking, Vane rushed toward it, throwing it open. What they saw on the other side made his blood run cold. It was the ballroom of the Washoe Club, but it was filled with the dead figures draped in tattered, turn-of-the-century clothing, their hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. In the center of the room stood the Phantom, his twisted smile wider than ever. "Welcome," he said softly, his voice dripping with malice. "You've finally found your way." The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a death knell throughout the decaying ballroom. Vane stood frozen, his eyes darting from the Phantom to the rows of ghostly figures standing eerily still, their faces locked in expressions of despair. The air felt suffocating, thick with the weight of unseen eyes watching their every move. "Graves," Vane whispered, barely able to speak. "What is this?" Graves' face was pale, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. "This is something far worse than we expected," she muttered. "I don't think we're dealing with just spirits anymore." The Phantom stepped forward, his feet barely touching the ground as he moved with a glide that was both graceful and horrifying. His red eyes gleamed with malevolent intent. "You should have left when you had the chance," he rasped. "But now, you belong to the Washoe." Behind the Phantom, The ghostly figures began to stir. Their heads jerked unnaturally, their movements stiff and robotic, as though something was pulling their strings. Vane could see the faint shimmer of the tar-like substance dripping from their empty eyes, pooling at their feet and soaking into the rotting wooden floor. "We need to get out of here," Hayes whispered, gripping his weapon tightly. "Now." But the phantom only smiled wider, his teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. "There is no leaving. Not anymore. The house has claimed you. The Washoe wants you." Suddenly, the ghosts lunged forward, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. The air grew colder, and the overwhelming stench of decay filled Vane's lungs. He fired his weapon, the bullet passing through one of the figures without any effect. "Useless," Graves shouted, pulling out the UV light and sweeping it across the room. The beam burned into the ghosts, causing them to flinch back, but the phantom remained unfazed. "Your toys won't save you," the phantom hissed. "Not here." The ballroom began to twist, the walls warping as if the house itself was alive, pulsing with energy. The floor beneath them shifted, cracks spreading like veins. The tar-like substance bubbled up through the gaps, seeping toward their feet. Vane grabbed Graves and Hayes, pulling them toward the far side of the room. "There has to be a way out. Find a door, anything." But the room stretched on endlessly, the door they had entered through now gone, replaced by more walls, more cracked mirrors reflecting their terrified faces back at them. The tar began to rise, filling the room with a thick, nauseating stench. It crawled up their legs, burning like acid where it touched their skin. "We can't stay here," Graves cried, her voice high with panic. "It's going to consume us." Just as the tar reached Vane's knees, a loud crash came from above. The ceiling buckled, and suddenly, a group of figures dropped through the collapsing roof. Rescue teams, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "We got your call," one of the rescuers shouted, his voice echoing over the chaos. "Hold on." But before they could reach them, the tar surged upward, swallowing two of the rescuers whole. The phantom laughed, the sound grating and hollow. "Fools, you think you can escape?" Vane's heart pounded as he watched the rescue team fight against the rising tide of blackness. One by one, they disappeared, their screams swallowed by the void. The last thing Vane saw before the darkness consumed him was the phantom's twisted smile. Vane awoke to silence. His body felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on him. Slowly, he opened his eyes and found himself lying on the cold, stone floor of the Washoe Club ballroom. The air was still thick with the smell of decay, but the black tar had receded, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence on the floor. Graves and Hayes lay nearby, both unconscious but alive. Vane forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling from exhaustion and fear. The ballroom was empty now, the ghosts and the phantom gone, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow over the room. We survived," Hayes groaned, slowly sitting up. He looked around, dazed, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Where did they all go?" Graves sat up as well, her face pale and her hands shaking as she checked her equipment. "I don't know," she said softly, "but we need to leave. Now." They staggered to their feet, moving toward the one door that remained, the one leading out of the ballroom. Vane pushed it open, half expecting the hallway to stretch endlessly once again. But this time it was different. The hallway was silent. The portraits that had once watched them now faded and still. No whispers, no shadows, just emptiness. As they made their way through the club, the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on them. The rescue team had been devoured, lost to the house. The tar had come from nowhere, and the phantom had simply vanished. "Do you think it's over?" Hayes asked, his voice barely audible. Graves shook her head. "The Washoe doesn't let go that easily." They reached the entrance of the club, the cold night air hitting them like a wave of relief. But as they stepped outside, Vane felt something cold brush the back of his neck. He turned, and there, just inside the doorway, stood the phantom, his red eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You may have escaped," the phantom whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "But the Washoe will never let you go." Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Vane stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway. The Washoe Club loomed behind him, silent and still, but he knew that it would never truly be over.